On a cold February night in 1952, a routine mail flight vanished somewhere over the Colorado Rockies. The pilot, Lieutenant Jack Weaver, sent one final radio transmission before disappearing from radar, a chilling message that air traffic controllers swore couldn't have come from this world. For 3 days, search crews scoured the mountains until they found the wreck, burned, twisted, and silent. But the strange part wasn't where they found Jack. It was when his voice was heard again, on an open frequency, 5 hours after his death was confirmed. In early 1952, Colorado's skies were both a lifeline and a graveyard. Small aircraft ferried mail, supplies, and hope across the harsh mountainous terrain. Where trains often froze and roads vanished beneath avalanches, pilots were called sky cowboys, men who risked everything to keep remote towns connected. Among them was Lieutenant Jack Weaver, a former Air Force pilot who'd flown combat missions in the Pacific during World War II. To those who knew him, Jack was the embodiment of calm precision, a man who never took chances, who studied weather reports like scripture, and who had an almost superstitious respect for the sky. By February, snowstorms had begun to ease and mail routes resumed their nightly rhythm. On February 21st, Jack was assigned to fly Air Mail Flight 237, a Beechcraft Model 18 twin-engine aircraft loaded with sacks of correspondence bound for Denver. It was a routine run he'd flown dozens of times before. The weather forecast predicted light winds and moderate visibility, though conditions could shift unpredictably over the Rockies. Jack checked his equipment 3 times, signed the dispatch log at 9:52 p.m., and joked with the hangar mechanic that he'd be home before the ink dries. The first leg of the journey was smooth. At 10:14 p.m., controllers in Salt Lake logged his transmission, confirming altitude and bearing. His voice, as always, was calm and precise, but around 10:27 radar showed an unexpected deviation. Flight 237 began climbing sharply. That's when the first odd report came through. Jack's voice crackled faintly through static. "Tower, something's wrong with the horizon. It's not moving." The phrase puzzled operators. They assumed he meant instrument failure or optical illusion from storm glare. Before they could respond, his signal cut abruptly. Controllers attempted to reach him for the next hour. Nothing but open frequency hum. The aircraft vanished from radar completely. No distress call, no emergency beacon. At dawn, the Civil Aeronautics Authority declared the flight missing. Search efforts began immediately. Air patrols were dispatched from Denver and Colorado Springs, their eyes scanning endless snowdrifts and jagged ridgelines. The mountainous terrain made aerial searches nearly impossible. Every glint of metal could be a false lead, sunlight bouncing off ice or shale. But by the 3rd day, an experienced search pilot spotted something unusual near a remote ridge west of Monarch Pass, a thin plume of smoke rising from snow that hadn't yet melted. When the recovery team reached the site, they found the wreckage of Jack's Beechcraft half buried in the snow, nose first into a slope. The right wing was torn away, the fuselage twisted. Much of the mail cargo had burned. In the cockpit, Jack's body was still strapped into his seat, charred but intact enough for identification. His watch had stopped at 10:35 p.m. The coroner's estimate confirmed death on impact, instantaneous. Investigators noted no sign of mechanical failure. The engines were functional before the crash. The weather, though turbulent, wasn't catastrophic. Curiously, both compasses were found pointing several degrees off magnetic north, an anomaly that couldn't be explained by local conditions. News of Jack's death hit the community hard. In the small Colorado town where his wife and young daughter lived, church bells rang for him at dusk. The local paper printed his photo beside the headline, "Mail Pilot Lost in Mountain Crash." To most, it was another tragic loss in the unforgiving mountain routes. But to those who had heard his final transmission, something didn't sit right. The horizon? It's not moving. It wasn't a distress call, it was confusion, almost as if Jack was seeing something the human eye shouldn't. When the recovery team confirmed Jack Weaver's death at the crash site, the case should have ended there. A tragic but routine aviation disaster in the unforgiving Colorado mountains. Yet what came next would turn a standard investigation into one of the most unsettling incidents in post-war aviation history. It began quietly just hours after the crash report was filed. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the Denver Air Traffic Control Tower, the same one that had received Jack's last transmission, picked up a faint but distinct signal on his old frequency, 128.4 meters. The channel had already been cleared for the night. Only static filled the air. Then suddenly a voice broke through. Mail 237 to tower. Visibility clear. Requesting landing vector. The operator on duty, Robert Gaines, froze. He recognized that voice instantly. He had spoken to Jack Weaver dozens of times during flights. The tone was steady, confident, unmistakably human. It didn't sound like a recording, and it sounded live. Gaines's first thought was that it must be another pilot mistakenly using Weaver's call sign. But the voice repeated the same phrase, this time with faint background noise, the rhythmic hum of a Beechcraft engine and what sounded like the soft crackle of a cockpit microphone. Mail 237 to tower. Tower, do you copy? Gaines leaned forward, his heart pounding. The time of death had already been confirmed. Jack Weaver's wrecked plane lay cold and silent hundreds of miles away. Still, Gaines responded instinctively. Mail 237, this is Denver Tower. State your location. For a few seconds, there was only static. Then through the static came a faint, distorted reply. Still can't see the horizon. Then the frequency went dead. The next morning, Gaines filed a full incident report expecting to be dismissed or reprimanded. Instead, his supervisor ordered the log sealed. Within days, the Civil Aeronautics Authority sent 2 investigators to Denver, men who introduced themselves only by last names, Hughes and McClellan. They confiscated the tower's recordings from that night and questioned Gaines for hours. When he asked whether the transmission had been explained, they told him, "There are atmospheric reasons for everything. Mr. Gaines, let's leave it at that." But Gaines couldn't leave it. Word spread quietly among the radio operators in Denver and Colorado Springs. Several of them had heard fragments of the same voice over the next 2 nights, not as clear but eerily familiar. One claimed to have heard the sound of a man breathing heavily, whispering into the static. Another reported the faint click of cockpit switches, followed by silence. Audio specialists who examined the brief surviving recording before it was seized noted something odd. The voice contained micro-variations, the same natural imperfections found in live speech. Recordings of that era lacked such fidelity. There were no playback distortions, no looping artifacts. It wasn't just Jack's voice. It was Jack's presence. Some technicians speculated it might have been skip interference, a rare phenomenon where radio waves bounce between atmospheric layers, sometimes carrying signals thousands of miles from their origin. But that explanation fell apart when they considered one fact. The wreck's radio had been completely destroyed in the fire. The entire cockpit was charred metal and melted dials. There was no power source left to transmit anything. Reporters tried to access the investigation files, but the CAA quickly declared them restricted. The official statement cited equipment malfunction and environmental interference, closing the case. Yet within the community of pilots, whispers grew louder. Men who had flown with Jack described strange sensations during later flights. Radios that turned on by themselves. Frequencies that hummed faintly when tuned to 128.4 MHz. And the sound of a man's voice repeating, Mail 237 to tower. For years, those who heard it were brushed off as superstitious or unstable. But one chilling detail united their accounts. The transmissions always came between 3 and 3:15 a.m., the exact window when the first post-crash signal was logged. It was as if Jack Weaver's voice was caught in some invisible loop, trapped between 2 times, one when he was alive and one when he was already gone. When the story of Jack Weaver's final transmission reached the public, most people dismissed it as another piece of aviation folklore, one of those ghostly tales that pilots told to fill the silence of long, lonely flights. But for the people who had actually been there, the air traffic operators, the search teams, and the local men who trudged up those frozen slopes, the memory of that winter never faded. They had seen things, and more than a few of them claimed to have heard things too. The official reports may have been buried, but their testimonies painted a far darker and more bewildering picture. Robert Gaines, the tower operator who first received Jack's posthumous call, was the most vocal. After being pressured into silence by investigators, he began privately keeping notes, dates, times, and details of every strange signal he intercepted. In the weeks after the crash, he logged 5 separate instances of faint, intermittent transmissions on 128.4 MHz. Each time, the voice was the same, male, calm, clipped, and nearly identical to Jack Weaver's. Gaines recalled one particular night when he was alone in the control room, the rest of the crew having stepped out for coffee. It was just after 3 in the morning when the receiver began to hiss softly. Then came the unmistakable hum of propeller rotation, followed by a slow, shallow breathing pattern, almost as if someone was sitting right there. Inside the cockpit again. "Tower," the voice whispered, low and trembling. "I can see the lights, but they're not Denver." Gaines said he froze completely. The frequency dropped into static for half a minute before fading out entirely. The next day he told no one. He simply wrote the line down in his logbook, boxed it in red ink, and underlined the word lights. Meanwhile, 50 miles west, near Monarch Pass, the search crews stationed to retrieve what remained of Flight 237 were reporting their own inexplicable experiences. Most of them were volunteers from the local mining towns, rugged men used to hardship, not superstition. But in the days they spent near the wreckage, some began to whisper about odd sounds at night, faint radio chatter that seemed to rise and fall with the wind, and what one described as a man talking from somewhere up the ridge, like through a metal tube. A deputy from Gunnison County, part of the retrieval unit, later told a Denver newspaper that their handheld receivers picked up bursts of static resembling Morse code, even though none of the crew were transmitting. When one of them tried to reply, the device reportedly emitted a shrill feedback tone so loud that it cracked the casing. Several men refused to go back up after that. Then came the account of Sergeant William Holt, an Air Force officer temporarily assigned to assist with navigation mapping during the search. Holt, a pragmatic man by all accounts, told colleagues that he'd been standing near the wreck when his compass began to spin uncontrollably. Moments later, his portable transceiver, which wasn't even tuned to Jack's channel, clicked alive and played a faint repeating voice. "Still can't see the horizon," it said again and again until Holt turned it off in panic. Even the dogs used for recovery operations behaved strangely. Handlers reported them whining, digging in the snow near the cockpit remains, then suddenly bolting downslope as if chased. At first, these behaviors were dismissed as nerves or weather-related static, but as more witnesses began describing the same eerie rhythmic signal, investigators could no longer chalk it up to imagination. In a quiet effort to contain hysteria, the Civil Aeronautics Authority declared the area off-limits to civilians, citing unstable conditions and environmental hazards. The crews were recalled, and the site was covered by snowfall soon after. Yet in the years that followed, locals continued to tell of hearing voices through their shortwave radios when the weather turned cold. A calm male voice identifying itself as Male 237 asking, again and again, for a landing vector that would never come. To understand why Jack Weaver's story unsettled so many, one has to look at the world of aviation in 1952, a time when flight itself still carried an aura of danger and discovery. America was only a few years removed from World War II, and the skies were filled with surplus military aircraft repurposed for civilian use. Pilots like Jack were veterans, disciplined and fearless, but they were also pioneers navigating a landscape that was only partially mapped and poorly understood. Colorado, with its towering ranges and unpredictable winds, was one of the most treacherous places to fly. Instruments were primitive, weather forecasting unreliable, and radio transmission often distorted by the sheer magnetism of the mountains themselves. Male pilots were considered a different breed. They flew alone, through storms and snow squalls, often without a co-pilot or navigator. Their cargo wasn't gold or passengers, it was paper, ink, and human connection. Letters from soldiers' widows, war veterans' pension checks, telegrams of birth and death. There was a kind of solemn pride in the work. The public rarely knew their names, but towns depended on them like lifelines. And yet, because of the risks, airmail routes were filled with stories of men who vanished into clouds never to be found. In this world, Jack Weaver was both ordinary and exceptional. Born in Kansas and raised on the edge of Dust Bowl country, he grew up watching planes trace the horizon, dreaming of joining them. The war gave him that chance. He flew B-25 bombers in the Pacific, surviving several close calls before returning home. Those who knew him said he carried a quiet restlessness afterward, a feeling that he'd left part of himself in the sky. When the airmail service expanded westward, Jack signed up immediately. He once told a colleague, "It's the only time I feel the world makes sense, when I'm above it." By the early 1950s, the Rocky Mountain routes had become notorious for sudden disappearances. Planes could fly into a storm cloud and simply never emerge. Entire wrecks were swallowed by canyons or buried under snowdrifts that wouldn't thaw for years. Locals whispered about the air graves of Colorado, unmarked resting places for hundreds of pilots who had flown into the unknown. Against this backdrop, Jack's fate wasn't unique. What was unique was what came after. In the tense years following the war, Americans were fascinated by stories of strange lights in the sky and signals that couldn't be explained. The Roswell incident had occurred only 5 years earlier. Reports of phantom aircraft and ghost echoes, radar returns from planes that didn't exist, became frequent topics in both aviation circles and newspapers. Many believed these phenomena were tied to experimental military programs. Others leaned toward something stranger, an overlap between atmospheric science and the supernatural. Colorado, with its magnetic anomalies and violent storms, was a focal point of such speculation. Pilots often reported compasses spinning mid-flight, radios going dead, or unfamiliar voices breaking through their transmissions. Scientists later theorized that the combination of high-altitude static, temperature inversion, and metallic ore deposits could cause unique distortions in signal propagation, but even that didn't account for the precision and personality of the voices some claimed to hear. Within that atmosphere of half science, half fear, Jack Weaver's story became a kind of legend. It merged with a broader national unease, the sense that technology was beginning to reach beyond what humans could comprehend. To the engineers at the Civil Aeronautics Authority, Jack's posthumous transmissions were an embarrassment, a mystery that threatened the public's trust in aviation. To the old male pilots who gathered in small bars from Denver to Cheyenne, it was a warning, a reminder that not everything flying over those mountains was meant to return. Even today, historians studying early flight records note that the Weaver incident sits on a fault line between rational explanation and myth. It belongs to a time when man's faith in machines was absolute, yet his understanding of what lived within the atmosphere was still uncertain. In that fragile era, every flight across Colorado's night sky was both a triumph and a gamble, and sometimes, when the radios went quiet, the line between heaven and earth disappeared entirely. In the weeks following the discovery of Jack Weaver's wreckage, the mountains around Monarch Pass seemed to develop a presence of their own. Locals who had lived their entire lives in those high valleys began speaking of strange occurrences. Compass needles trembling without cause, radios hissing to life at odd hours, and flickering lights that danced over the snow before vanishing into the dark. At first, no one dared to connect these things to the crash. The region was known for unpredictable weather, electrical disturbances, and mirages that could trick even seasoned mountaineers. But gradually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time the wind shifted east and the air grew unnaturally still, the transmissions returned. On the evening of March 5th, 2 highway patrol officers driving along Route 50 reported picking up faint aviation chatter on their car radio, despite it being tuned to a local AM station. One of them, a veteran named Paul Briggs, later swore that the voice was calm, professional, and distinctly military in tone. It said only, "Mail 237 to Tower, you request vector," followed by a burst of static. Briggs thought it must be a rebroadcast of an older recording, perhaps from training exercises, but when he mentioned it at the next day's debriefing, one of the other officers went pale. The number 237 had already become infamous across the state's aviation circles. A week later, a group of Forest Service rangers stationed near the crash site claimed that their shortwave radios began emitting a rhythmic tapping sound, like Morse code, though none of them could identify the sequence. The tapping grew louder whenever they approached the ridge where Jack's plane had gone down. Then late one night, as a storm approached, one of the younger rangers heard a man's voice beneath the thunder, faint and echoing through the static. The horizon, it's still not moving. When he repeated this to his captain, the man told him to forget it. That isolation, exhaustion, and thin air could make anyone hear things. Yet when the captain's own compass spun violently the next morning, even he refused to return to that part of the mountain. Locals began referring to the area as the Whispering Ridge. Hunters who passed near it claimed their transistor radios flickered to life with ghostly chatter, and miners working deep underground said their lamps dimmed in perfect rhythm with a sound like an airplane engine circling overhead. One night, a farmer in the nearby town of Sargents reported seeing lights sweeping across the valley as though from a plane attempting to land. But there was no engine sound, no physical craft, just the steady glow of something gliding silently over the snow before it faded into the tree line. Scientists and amateur radio enthusiasts tried to investigate. A team from the University of Colorado set up monitoring equipment in early April, hoping to capture the supposed transmissions. For 3 nights, they heard nothing unusual, but on the 4th night, their instruments recorded a faint male voice on a dead frequency. The voice repeated a simple phrase over and over: "Male 237, request approach." When analyzed later, the signal showed no source direction, no point of origin. It appeared to come from nowhere, a free-floating transmission existing in static itself. Even more unsettling were the personal effects found near the crash site months later, when the snow finally melted. A search party uncovered fragments of charred mailbags, warped instruments, and a pilot's headset, still attached to a half-melted cord. When technicians tested it, they discovered the internal wiring was fused, as if exposed to a sudden extreme burst of energy. Yet on one of the headset's switches, a faint residue of ash bore what looked like fingerprints, too fresh, according to lab reports, to have survived a February fire. By summer, the government quietly dismantled the remaining wreckage and declared the ridge closed to all civilian access. But those who lived in nearby valleys said that on calm nights, when the moon rose pale and cold over the Rockies, they could still hear the soft hum of propellers in the distance, circling endlessly through the clouds. And if you tuned an old radio just right at exactly 3 a.m, you could catch a man's voice, steady, polite, and impossibly far away, asking for permission to come home. The official investigation into Flight 237 began in early March 1952, and from the very beginning, it seemed designed less to discover truth than to contain it. The Civil Aeronautics Authority assigned 2 lead investigators, both men with backgrounds in the military rather than civilian aviation. Their arrival in Denver was abrupt and quiet. They spoke little to the press, refused interviews, and insisted that all tower recordings, maintenance logs, and even personal notebooks from radio operators be surrendered immediately. What puzzled many was how quickly they seemed to conclude that the incident was a tragic case of pilot error, compounded by adverse weather conditions. Within a week, the preliminary report was filed, but no one who had seen the wreck believed that story. The investigators conducted only one brief visit to the crash site before sealing it off, allegedly due to unstable terrain. They took samples of the soil and fragments of the fuselage, though none were ever returned for local review. The report described Jack Weaver's final moments as a disorientation event, an aviation term used when pilots lose their sense of up and down due to optical illusions or instrument malfunction. Yet that explanation failed to align with the recovered instruments, which were in near-perfect calibration before the crash. The altimeter, even burned and warped, still indicated a level flight path. There was no evidence that Jack had descended suddenly or intentionally. Air traffic controllers, especially Robert Gaines, were deeply unsettled. Gaines had already been warned by the investigators to cease speaking publicly about any post-crash transmissions. He was told the recordings were being analyzed and would not be returned for national security reasons. It was an odd phrase for a routine mail flight case. When Gaines pressed for clarification, one of the investigators, McClellan, told him coldly, "Some frequencies are not meant to be reopened." After that, Gaines was reassigned to a different post and warned that further discussion could jeopardize his license. Behind the scenes, the tone of the investigation darkened. Witnesses who had reported hearing Jack's voice after the crash were contacted privately and told not to repeat their statements. One of the forest rangers who had been stationed near Monarch Pass later told a Denver journalist that a pair of military men visited his outpost, removed all the radio logs, and confiscated his receiver. He described their demeanor as polite but firm, the kind of authority that needed no badge. "They didn't care what I'd heard," he said. "They cared that I'd written it down." Within weeks, the case files were reclassified, transferred to an unspecified federal archive, and effectively erased from public access. Even decades later, aviation historians attempting to retrieve those documents through the Freedom of Information Act were told that the records were incomplete or had been lost during reorganization. But internal correspondence that survived in private collections revealed a telling pattern. One memo referenced electromagnetic anomalies inconsistent with known atmospheric behavior. Another mentioned unusual spectral readings from recovered material. These phrases, vague as they were, hinted that something at the crash site had confounded even the scientific explanations. For the people of Colorado, the government's silence became its own kind of confession. Locals believed that something had been found among the wreckage. Not necessarily supernatural, but something inexplicable enough to warrant secrecy. Rumors spread that the wreck had emitted a strange residual signal when disturbed, that Geiger counters had flickered erratically near the fuselage, and that investigators returned from the site visibly shaken. None of these claims were verified, but the absence of open information made them feel true. Over time, the story of Flight 237 slipped from headlines and entered the realm of folklore. But among aviation circles, whispers persisted that the investigation's abrupt closure was less about embarrassment and more about containment. You can't catalog what doesn't fit the laws of transmission, one retired technician said years later. It's easier to pretend it never happened. In the end, the official narrative reduced Jack Weaver's flight to a routine accident, a man lost to the mountains, undone by his own instruments. Yet buried in sealed files and forgotten testimonies was a more troubling possibility. That something in the high air that night, some intersection of signal, magnetism and death, and had opened a doorway, and for a moment, a pilot on the edge of the world had called back from whatever lay beyond. The decades that followed Jack Weaver's crash transformed his story from a closed case into one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. Time weathered the facts, blurring official accounts with whispered retellings passed from one generation of pilots to the next. Yet even as memory faded, one detail refused to die. That voice on the radio, steady, composed, impossible. For some it was merely folklore, a chilling tale to tell in the dim glow of hangar lights. But for others, those who had heard the transmission themselves or found echoes of it on forgotten frequencies, it became something closer to faith or fear. In 1967, 15 years after the crash, a group of amateur radio operators in Colorado Springs reported picking up a brief repeating signal late one winter night. The voice was faint, almost swallowed by static, but several listeners captured it on tape. It said only "Mail 237 to Tower, visibility clear." The recording was analyzed and dismissed by experts as interference, yet the spectral qualities of the sound, the way it carried a mechanical hum beneath the words, were eerily similar to the 1952 tape seized from Denver Tower. Those who compared them noted the same tonal rhythm, the same deliberate cadence. It was, in all technical respects, the same man speaking 15 years apart. Over the years, such reports multiplied. Truck drivers crossing Route 50 late at night claimed to hear faint aviation chatter bleeding into their radios. Always the same frequency, always the same clipped phrasing. Campers near Monarch Pass described a disembodied male voice that seemed to move with the wind, fading in and out like a conversation caught between two worlds. One retired pilot even claimed to have received a direct transmission while flying over the Rockies in 1974. Tower, this is Mail 237, request vector. I'm still off course. When air traffic control was alerted, they checked every radar screen in the region. Nothing appeared. Scientists and skeptics tried to rationalize the phenomenon. Some proposed that it was an atmospheric echo, a freak recurrence of radio waves trapped and refracted through ionized air layers, replaying fragments of the past. Others argued it was deliberate, an elaborate hoax kept alive by opportunists who fed on mystery. But none could explain why the signal was so consistent, why it seemed to occur only in the dead of night, and why it always came within a few miles of the original crash site. By the 1980s, the Weaver transmission had evolved into a legend whispered among airmen. Pilots who flew over that part of Colorado often reported sudden equipment interference, altimeters flickering, radios tuning themselves, or momentary compass swings toward the northwest ridge. A few claimed to hear a calm male voice breaking through their headsets, even when the frequency was inactive. Some laughed it off as nerves or atmospheric pressure. Others landed visibly shaken. In 1992, a retired air traffic controller named Thomas Leland released a small self-published memoir titled The Pilot Who Wouldn't Stop Calling. In it, he described his own experiences monitoring Colorado frequencies during the 1950s. He admitted that several operators, including himself, had heard Jack Weaver's voice more than once. Not just that first night, but years afterward. It was as if, Leland wrote, the man was flying in a loop that never ended, calling out into a sky that no longer exists. The book was largely ignored, but among radio archivists and paranormal researchers, it became a quiet cult artifact. Even now, strange reports persist. Hikers with handheld transceivers claim they've caught brief phrases, fragments like, "still can't see the horizon," or "approach lights ahead." No signal ever repeats twice, and no source can be traced. Technicians who've studied these anomalies note that the frequencies often carry background distortion consistent with mid-century equipment, as though the voice were transmitting through machinery that hasn't existed for 70 years. Locals near Monarch Pass still speak of nights when the wind carries more than sound. They say that when storms move through the high canyons, radios hum faintly even when turned off. They say that if you stand quietly at the ridge where Flight 237 went down, you can sometimes feel the air tremble, not from thunder, but from something deeper, like an engine idling beyond time. And if you listen closely enough just before the static fades, a man's voice still breaks through, calm and certain, repeating the same words he's been sending since 1952. Mail 237 to Tower, requesting landing vector. If voices can cross from the other side of the mountains, what if they can cross from the other side of time? Jack Weaver's last transmission wasn't just a signal. It was a question left hanging in the air, waiting for someone to answer. Maybe that's why even now some still tune in late at night, hoping to catch a whisper from the past. If you believe some stories refuse to die, stay with us. Subscribe and step deeper into the forgotten corridors of history, where every mystery still echoes, and every silence hides a truth. Tell me what you think. Was it atmospheric trickery, or something far stranger? A soul still circling its final descent? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your theories may help uncover the next forgotten case we explore. Because in this world, the past doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it calls back. And when it does, you'll want to be listening. Subscribe now, and don't miss what comes through the static next.